There is a particular kind of quiet that settles in around this hour, and if you're hearing my voice right now, you have probably already found it. So let yourself sink into the mattress a little further. Let your shoulders drop. Tonight I want to take you somewhere very far away to a world so old that fire itself does not exist yet, and see what it actually took for a human body to survive inside it. Before you drift too deep, here is what is at stake tonight. 2 million years ago, the ancestors of every person alive today are running out of hours in the day. Not hours to work or to travel or to rest. Hours simply to eat enough to stay alive. Their bodies are demanding more energy than raw food can give them, and if nothing changes, if no solution arrives, the long climb towards becoming human simply stops here on the savannah unfinished. Picture a woman crouched at the edge of a slow brown river as the light starts to fail. She is small by our standards, barely 5 feet tall, with a heavy brow and powerful jaw, and she has been chewing since before the sun reached its highest point. In her lap sits a fibrous root she pulled from the mud that morning, and beside her a strip of antelope meat scavenged from a kill that vultures had already circled twice. She tears at the meat with her back teeth, working it slowly, because raw meat does not give itself up easily. Her jaw aches in a way that has become simply a part of living. 2 children sit near her, small enough that they cannot yet manage the toughest fibers on their own, and she softens what she can for them between her own teeth, first the way her mother did for her. Somewhere behind her the grass moves in a way that might be wind or might not be. She does not turn to look. She has learned that turning wastes chewing time, and chewing time is the only thing standing between her family and a slow grinding hunger that never quite goes away no matter how much they gather. This is not an unusual evening for her, it is every evening. And this is the detail that tends to surprise people most when they first hear it. Researchers who study the eating habits of modern chimpanzees. Our closest living relatives have found that a wild chimpanzee spends something close to 6 hours of every single day simply chewing, not gathering, not resting, chewing. Multiply that across a lifetime, and you begin to understand why an early hominin's day had so little room left in it for anything else. There was no time to build, to wander far in search of better ground, to sit and think for the sheer pleasure of thinking. The mouth was a factory that never closed, and the body it fed still was not thriving. What almost nobody realizes is that this was not simply an inconvenience of prehistoric life. It may have been the single tightest bottleneck our species ever passed through, a moment where biology itself seemed to be running out of options long before anyone had a word for hunger or for fire or for the future. Before we go further into how that bottleneck was finally broken and what it cost and what it built, I want to ask something small of you. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the real story told slowly and without flinching, but never in a way that keeps you awake past your own bedtime, take a moment now to follow along and leave a like before you settle in fully. It helps more than you would think, and it costs you nothing but a second of your evening. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight and what drew you to a story like this one. I read every one, and I am always a little moved by how far this reaches. Now get comfortable, because we are about to go back further than almost any story you have heard before. To understand what that woman by the river was living through, you have to understand what her body actually needed and what the world around her was willing to give. The human brain we carry today, the one reading these words in your mind right now, is an extraordinarily expensive organ. It burns through energy at a rate far beyond what its size would suggest, using something close to 1/5 of the body's total resting energy, despite making up only about 2% of total body weight. That number would eventually make us the strangest primate the planet had ever produced. But 2 million years ago, no hominin brain came anywhere close to that scale, and the reason may be simpler and more physical than most people assume. A brain that expensive cannot be built or maintained on a diet that has to be chewed for 6 hours a day and still barely covers the basic cost of living. Look closely at the skulls that survive from this period, and the body's priorities become almost visible in the bone itself. The jaw is heavy wide, anchored by the muscle attachments large enough to leave permanent ridges across the top of the skull. The molars are broad and flat built for grinding fibrous stems and tough sinewy meat down into something small enough to swallow. The gut, reconstructed from the shape of the ribcage and pelvis, is large as well a wide barrel of a torso, built to hold a long, slow digestive tract. Because raw plant fiber does not release its calories easily, and the body has to compensate with sheer processing time. Every part of this design speaks to the same underlying problem. Getting enough usable energy out of raw unprocessed food is hard physical unglamorous work, and it shapes the body around itself the way water shapes a riverbed, slowly and without mercy. Scholars still debate exactly how tightly this energy constraint limited early hominin brain growth, and the honest answer is that no single piece of evidence settles it completely. What the fossil record does show fairly consistently is a long, frustratingly slow climb. For well over 1 million years, brain size among our ancestors increases, only gradually inching upward across many hundreds of generations, as though something is holding the door only slightly ajar. Meanwhile, the world these hominins live in offers little sympathy for a species running an energy deficit. The savanna is a hard, exposed, sun-bleached landscape dotted with acacia trees and dry grass that turns gold and brittle for months at a time. Fresh water is not always close. Predators are constant, patient, and better equipped for the dark than any human ancestor has ever been. A body caught between the need for more calories and a landscape unwilling to offer them easily does not get to simply decide to grow a bigger brain. It has to earn the right calorie by calorie, meal by meal, evening by exhausting evening. It helps to see this problem from another angle, one that has nothing to do with fossils at all. Watch a wild gorilla feed for a single afternoon, and you will notice something that looks almost like a full-time occupation. Gorillas process enormous quantities of leaves and stems every day, not because they enjoy the labor, but because plant fiber gives up so little energy per mouthful that volume becomes the only strategy left. Orangutans spend comparable stretches of their day working through tough fibrous bark and unripe fruit. Chimpanzees closer to us in body and behavior than any other living creature still lose those same long hours to chewing day after day, year after year, with no relief built into the system. Seen against that backdrop, the woman by the river is not an anomaly. She is doing exactly what every closely related primate on the planet has always done, following the same ancient rule that time spent eating is simply the price of staying alive. The strange part, the part worth sitting with for a moment, is that her descendants would eventually break that rule so completely that most of us alive today spend less than an hour a day eating anything at all. And yet something does eventually change. Somewhere in this long, grinding stretch of prehistory, a shift begins that will alter not just what our ancestors eat, but how their bodies are built, how their days are spent, how their children grow, and eventually how their minds work. It does not arrive as a single dramatic event that anyone at the time would have recognized as historic. It arrives slowly, unevenly tested, and lost and tested again across different groups in different places over an almost unimaginable span of time, but its effects, once they take hold, will ripple forward through every generation that follows, reshaping the human jaw, the human gut, and eventually the human brain itself, until the descendants of that exhausted woman by the river are capable of things she could never have imagined. As she sat there in the fading light, softening a piece of root between her teeth for a child who was hungry and would be hungry again by morning. That is where this story is headed tonight. Not toward a single hero or a single moment of triumph, but toward a slow, patient unraveling of one of the oldest and most stubborn problems our ancestors ever faced, and the strange, quiet discovery that would eventually solve it. Somewhere else along that same river on a morning no different from countless others, a hand closes around a stone. Not a special stone, just one that happens to have the right weight, the right edge, the right way of breaking when struck against another rock. The hand belongs to someone we would recognize distantly as one of our own kind, though barely, and what that hand is about to do will matter more than almost anyone at the time could have known. The problem the woman by the river carried into the last part of this story has not gone away. Chewing still eats the day alive. The gut still demands hours of grinding patient work before a single meal releases enough energy to be worth the effort. But somewhere in this same stretch of time, a quieter kind of experiment is already underway, one that has nothing to do with flame and everything to do with force. Strike a rock against another rock at the right angle, and it fractures in a way that leaves a sharp, thin edge behind. Early hominins working along riverbeds like this one discover, likely by accident at first, that such an edge can do something the human hand alone cannot. It can open a hide. It can strip meat away from bone far faster than teeth and fingers working together. It can crush a fibrous stem into something closer to pulp before a single tooth ever touches it. Archaeologists working in the Great Rift Valley of Eastern Africa have recovered stone tools of exactly this kind dating back roughly 2.5 million years. Simple, deliberately struck flakes and cores that show clear repeated patterns of human manufacture rather than random breakage. And cut marks preserved on animal bones from sites in the same region tell an even more specific story. Fine parallel grooves left by a sharp stone edge dragging across bone while stripping away meat, sometimes crossing older tooth marks left by the actual predator that made the kill in the first place. Our ancestors, it turns out, were not always the hunters in this picture. Often they were scavengers arriving after a lion or a leopard had already fed, working quickly and nervously to claim what remained before the next set of teeth arrived. There is something quietly humbling in that image. Long before spears, before fire, before anything we would call technology. In the way we use the word now. Survival sometimes meant standing over a half-eaten carcass in the open grass, stone in hand, glancing up every few seconds, racing daylight and predators, both to take a share of a meal that belonged briefly to something else. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how often this happened compared to active hunting, and the debate among researchers over the balance between scavenging and hunting in this period has run for decades without a final answer. But the tools themselves are not in question. They exist scattered and unmistakable wherever ancient rivers once cut through this landscape. What matters most for the story we are following tonight is not the hunting or the scavenging itself, but what that simple stone edge did to the meal once it was carried home. A slice of meat cut into thinner strips before it reaches the mouth requires less chewing to break down than the same meat torn in thick, resistant sections. A root pounded first between two stones softens before a single tooth engages it. Researchers who have studied this directly, by preparing food in controlled conditions and measuring exactly how much chewing force and time each method demands, have found that this kind of simple mechanical processing done with nothing more than a sharp flake and a heavy stone can cut the physical work of eating by a meaningful margin. Not all the way, not enough to fully solve the crisis, but enough to matter evening after evening, mouthful after mouthful across an entire population trying to survive on the same difficult landscape. This is the detail that tends to surprise people most once they hear it laid out plainly. Long before anyone tamed fire, our ancestors had already begun editing their food before it reached their teeth. The revolution did not begin at a hearth. It began at a riverbed with a rock in someone's hand and a very old, very practical problem they were trying, however crudely, to solve, and the body seems to have noticed. Compare the skulls of the earlier stone tool users to those of their heavier-jawed relatives living alongside them during roughly the same window of time, and a difference starts to emerge. The tool users tend to carry somewhat smaller teeth more lightly, built jaws, less of the massive chewing architecture that earlier and more heavily plant-dependent hominins relied on so completely. One particular branch of the family tree goes the opposite direction, entirely developing enormous molars and a skull built almost like scaffolding around the chewing muscles, a lineage sometimes nicknamed only half-jokingly by the researchers who study them for the sheer size of their bite. That branch eventually disappears from the fossil record altogether. The branch that leans instead on tools on cutting and pounding food before eating it is the one that continues generation after generation toward us. Scholars still debate how much credit to give this shift toward tool-assisted eating as opposed to other pressures acting on the body at the same time, changes in climate, in available plants and group size and cooperation. No single cause explains everything on its own, and anyone claiming certainty here is almost certainly overstating what the evidence can support. But taken together, the pattern is difficult to ignore. A population that finds even a modest way to reduce the sheer physical cost of eating gains something precious that cannot be measured in fossils alone, and that is time. Minutes returned from the jaw. An hour here, another there, no longer spent purely on the mechanical work of survival. It would be easy to imagine that extra hour as freedom, something bright and immediately rewarding. The truth, as it usually is, with this kind of history, sits closer to the ground. That hour likely went first to more searching, more walking, more carrying, because a hominin population living this close to the edge rarely converts saved effort directly into rest. Life on the savannah does not offer leisure easily, but even a small margin repeated across thousands of individuals and hundreds of generations begins to change what is possible. Mothers may have a little more capacity left at the end of the day for a second weaker infant that would otherwise not have survived the season. Groups may range slightly farther before exhaustion sets in, reaching water sources or safer sleeping ground they could not have managed before. None of this shows up as a single dramatic turning point in the fossil record. It shows up instead as a slow bending of the odds, almost invisible at the scale of any one lifetime, unmistakable across the scale of an epoch. There is another layer to this shift that researchers have only pieced together more recently, one that connects directly back to the expensive energy-hungry brain we spoke of already. The digestive system is not a passive organ sitting quietly inside the body. It is active tissue, constantly maintained, constantly fed with blood and oxygen, and by some estimates it consumes nearly as much of the body's daily energy budget as the brain itself. A long, wide gut built to process large volumes of raw fibrous food is not free to carry. It has an upkeep cost of its own every single day, whether or not a meal is currently moving through it. Some researchers studying the comparative anatomy of primates have proposed that a body cannot easily afford both an oversized gut and an oversized brain at the same time that the two organs are in a sense competing for the same limited pool of daily energy. Shrink the gut even slightly through food that requires less raw processing, and a small amount of that saved energy becomes available elsewhere. The evidence for this trade-off remains debated, and no single study proves the mechanism beyond question, but the underlying logic fits neatly with everything else this landscape seems to be teaching its inhabitants. Nothing here is free. Every gram of tissue, every hour of the day is already spoken for, and the smallest efficiency gained in one place is the only kind of currency this species has to spend anywhere else. Picture for a moment what one of these scavenging mornings might actually feel like from the inside. The air still carries the particular smell of a fresh kill blood and torn grass, and something sharper underneath the scent that draws vultures circling from miles away before a single hominin ever arrives on the scene. There is no time for hesitation once the carcass is reached. Hyenas may already be watching from the tree line, patient in a way that feels almost personal. Hands move quickly, stone edge, catching the low morning light, cutting free whatever meat can be claimed before the balance of danger tips the wrong way. It is not a triumphant scene. It is closer to a narrow, practiced negotiation with risk, repeated as often as hunger demands it, and hunger on this landscape rarely waits long between visits. Dental evidence adds one more thread to this picture, a quieter one written not in stone tools but in the teeth themselves. Researchers studying the microscopic wear patterns left on fossil molars, the tiny pits and scratches created by different foods grinding it against enamel over a lifetime, have found noticeable differences between the heavily built plant-dependent hominins of this era and the smaller-jawed tool using populations living nearby. The wear patterns suggest a broader, more flexible diet among the tool users, one that draws on meat tougher, plant fibre cut down mechanically before eating, and likely whatever else the landscape happens to offer in a given season. Flexibility in a world this unpredictable may have mattered nearly as much as raw efficiency. A population that can shift what it eats when one food source fails is a population with more paths available when the dry season runs long or the rains arrive late. There is a particular kind of ache to this part of the story, the part where you realize how much of what makes us human began not as a decision or an invention in any grand sense, but as a slight easing of a burden that never actually goes away. The stone tool does not end the crisis this species is living through. It does not deliver a body's worth of extra energy overnight, and it does not remove the danger of scavenging near a lion's kill, or the risk of a badly struck flake slicing open a hand instead of a hide. What it offers is smaller and in its own way more honest than that. A little less grinding, a little more room. Enough perhaps to keep a fragile population from tipping over the edge it has been walking along for longer than anyone standing on that riverbed could have possibly understood. And somewhere further along that same stretch of time, in a landscape still lit only by sun, and at times by the far more dangerous light of a wildfire moving across dry grass on its own, something else is beginning to stir. Not a tool this time, not a stone shaped by a careful hand. Something older and far less controlled, something that for now still belongs entirely to the sky and the dry season, watched from a careful distance by creatures who have not yet found a way to bring it any closer. Night does not announce itself gently on this landscape. It arrives the way a door closes quickly, completely, and once it has closed, there is very little a human body of this era can do except wait it out. That distant fire we glimpsed a moment ago moving on its own through dry grass somewhere along the horizon is not yet anything anyone can use. It is simply one more danger among many a wall of orange light that a small band of hominins learns to watch from a careful distance and never approach. For now, the only real defense against the dark is choosing each evening exactly the right place to disappear into it. That choice matters more than almost anything else in a day already full of difficult choices. The ground at night belongs to creatures far better suited to it than any hominin has ever been. Lions hunt most successfully after dusk, when their eyes gather what little light remains far more efficiently than human eyes ever could. Leopards prefer the same hours moving through low scrub and along riverbanks with a silence that gives almost no warning before it is already too late. A body without claws, without great speed, without night vision worth mentioning, has exactly one real strategy available to it once the sun goes down, and that strategy is elevation. Trees, cliff ledges, anywhere the ground predators of this world cannot easily follow. This is not guesswork built from imagination alone. It comes from something far stranger and more direct, written into the bones themselves. In the 1920s, a skull belonging to a small child was recovered from a limestone quarry in southern Africa, a find that would eventually become one of the most important fossils ever pulled from African soil. Decades later, researchers studying that same skull noticed something that had been missed. At first, a pattern of puncture marks and scarring around the eye sockets that did not match any known form of damage caused by burial weathering or geological pressure. What it matched almost exactly were the talon marks left by large birds of prey on the skulls of modern monkeys killed and eaten in the same way. The conclusion researchers eventually reached cautiously and not without ongoing debate is that this child, likely no older than 3, was carried off and killed by an eagle. Not a lion, not a leopard, a bird descending out of open sky onto a creature too small and too exposed to defend itself. Scholars still debate exactly how common this kind of predation was across the full population, since one remarkable fossil cannot tell you the shape of an entire era on its own. But it does not stand alone. In a set of caves further south, researchers have recovered hominin bones, bearing puncture marks whose spacing corresponds closely to the canine teeth of leopards, evidence that some of our ancestors were caught killed and very likely dragged up into trees to be eaten at leisure, the way leopards still cache their kills today, safely out of reach of scavenging hyenas below. It is a strange thing to realize, lying warm and safe as you are right now, that some of the very fossils which first taught us about our own deep past may exist today only because our ancestors were on that particular night somebody else's meal. For decades, the scientific understanding of these same damaged bones ran in almost exactly the opposite direction. The researcher who first studied many of these South African cave sites, working in the middle of the last century, looked at the broken skulls and shattered limb bones piling up alongside animal remains, and reached a dramatic conclusion that these injuries were evidence of a violent weapon wielding hominin, an early human ancestor who hunted, killed, and even fought among its own kind with tools of bone and horn. For a time, this idea shaped how an entire generation understood human origins. The notion that violence itself, not cooperation or intelligence, was the trait that set our lineage apart from the very beginning. It took another researcher, working painstakingly through the same caves years later, and comparing the damage directly against the feeding patterns of modern leopards, hyenas and porcupines to demonstrate something far less dramatic and, in its own way, far more unsettling. The bones were not evidence of hominins as hunters and warriors at all. They were the leftovers of hominins as prey dragged into these caves by the very predators the earlier researcher had imagined our ancestors defeating. The evidence remains incomplete on certain details even now, and debate over the exact ratio of predation to other causes of death continues among specialists, but the broader correction has held. An entire origin story built around early human violence quietly gave way to a far quieter, far more honest one built instead around vulnerability and the long patient work of simply staying alive until morning. There is something almost unbearably intimate about that fact, and also something quietly clarifying. It reframes an entire era not as a slow patient march toward humanity, but as a nightly negotiation for survival repeated without fail, in which losing meant not a setback but an ending. Given stakes like these, it makes sense that the body did not fully commit to life on solid ground even after walking upright became the normal way of moving through the day. Look closely at the hand and foot bones of the hominins living through this period, and you find something that looks almost like an argument still being settled inside a single skeleton. The legs are built increasingly for walking long distances across open ground, weight balanced over a single supporting foot with each stride, the pelvis reshaped to support an upright gait. But the fingers in several of these species remain distinctly curved, longer and more strongly built than a purely ground-dwelling animal would ever need, shaped instead for gripping branches securely for the specific practiced work of climbing quickly and confidently into a tree canopy before darkness closes in completely. The most reasonable reading of this evidence, though not the only one scholars have proposed, is that these hominins were living a kind of double life, walking upright and confidently across the savannah by day, while every single night without exception they still needed the option of disappearing upward into branches that no ground predator could reach. Imagine for a moment what that nightly climb must have actually felt like repeated for an entire lifetime. The last useful light fading fast along the horizon. A chosen tree, probably one used many times before its particular branches, already familiar by feel in the near dark. Children lifted, first guided or carried up into a fork wide enough to hold them safely through the night, wedged in place against smaller limbs, so a shift in sleep does not send them tumbling. Adults following, settling into positions that will have to serve as a bed for the next several hours, uncomfortable, cramped, and still infinitely safer than the ground below. Somewhere beneath them in the deepening dark, something moves through the grass with the unhurried confidence of a creature that already knows it holds every advantage after sunset. This is where a particular kind of exhaustion sets in, one that never entirely lifts one very different from the exhaustion of chewing tough food for hours or scavenging nervously beside a fresh kill. Researchers who study sleep across primate species have found that humans today sleep for noticeably fewer hours than most of our close relatives, yet spend a larger share of that shorter sleep in the deep restorative stages that matter most for recovery. One proposed explanation still debated, and impossible to confirm directly from fossils alone, is that something about the conditions our ancestors slept under exposed alert, interrupted by every unfamiliar sound gradually selected for a body that could extract more benefit from less total time. Asleep, because more total time asleep was never something this landscape was willing to offer. If that idea holds any truth at all, then something as ordinary as a good night's sleep, the kind most of us barely think about as we drift off tonight, may itself carry a faint distant echo of these very trees and the vigilance that never fully switched off inside them. There is a human cost to this that does not show up cleanly in any fossil, though it is not hard to imagine. A mother settling two children into a fork of branches while straining to hear whether the rustling below is only wind. An older member of the group past the age of easy climbing, choosing a lower, more exposed branch because the higher ones are simply beyond what aching joints can manage anymore, and accepting that risk quietly because there is rarely another option. The particular kind of watchfulness that never fully relaxes night after night, year after year, a background hum of readiness that shapes a person's whole relationship with darkness long before anyone has a word for anxiety or safety or rest. Baboons living across this same landscape today offer a useful if imperfect window into what that nightly arrangement might have looked like. Entire troops climb together each evening into the same handful of favoured cliffs or tall trees, returning to the identical roosting sites for generations, because a proven safe location once found is worth more than almost anything else the environment can offer. Individuals do not simply drop off to sleep the moment they settle. Researchers who have observed these troops after dark describe frequent brief waking moments throughout the night, heads lifting ears, turning toward any unfamiliar sound before sleep resumes. It is reasonable, though impossible, to prove directly that our own ancestors slept in something close to this same fragmented rhythm, never quite achieving the long, uninterrupted stretch of rest that most of us take for granted tonight, drifting off in a warm bed with the doors locked and nothing moving in the dark below. And yet even inside all of that vulnerability, something in this story is already leaning forward, waiting. That distant grass fire from earlier, the one nobody yet dares to approach, does something none of the predators moving through the dark ever do. It lights the ground around it. It pushes back, however briefly, against the very darkness that forces a family up into branches each night, exposed and straining to hold on until morning. No one crouching in a tree tonight understands what that orange light might someday be capable of, if it could only be carried closer, held rather than merely watched. But somewhere out there, past the edge of what anyone in this story can yet imagine, that possibility is already waiting in the grass, patient, indifferent, and closer than it has ever been before. Fire does not begin as an invention. Long before anyone learns to make it, fire is simply something that happens to the world, indifferent and enormous. And for a very long stretch of time it belongs entirely to lightning, to drought, to the dry season, doing what the dry season has always done. What changes eventually is not fire itself. It is the distance a hominin is accustomed to stand from it. Picture the aftermath of one of these natural burns, a grass fire sparked by a lightning strike days earlier, now mostly sent its edges cooling into grey ash across a blackened stretch of savanna. Something in that landscape is different the morning after, and it has nothing to do with warmth. The ground is cleared. Small animals caught by the flames, tortoises too slow to outrun the front of fire snakes, and rodents driven from cover lie scattered and already partly cooked across the burned earth, easy to find, easy to gather, requiring none of the dangerous nervous work of scavenging beside a fresh kill while predators circle. A scorched landscape, it turns out, briefly becomes one of the safest and most generous places a hungry hominin can visit. Long before anyone tends a single flame on purpose, our ancestors were almost certainly walking directly into the smoking ruins left behind by fires. They had no part in starting gathering a meal the fire had already, in its own violent way, prepared for them. Evidence for exactly this kind of behaviour exists at a handful of extraordinary sites scattered across the African landscape. In a cave in the interior of South Africa, cut deep into a hillside, researchers digging through layers that stretch back roughly 1 million years have recovered burned bone fragments and plant ash so far from the cave entrance that wind or an accidental grass fire could not plausibly have carried them there. Whatever burned in that cave burned because someone brought fire or fuel, or both, deep inside a space that no wildfire could ever have reached on its own. It stands today as some of the strongest and most carefully documented evidence anywhere in the world for fire, under at least some degree of hominin control at this early date. Even so, scholars still debate how much control that actually represents. Tending a fire, someone else started feeding it just enough to keep a single ember alive through the night, is a very different skill from being able to strike a spark into existence from nothing whenever the need arises. The evidence from this period speaks far more confidently to the first kind of relationship with fire than the second. An older claim from a site further east in what is now Kenya illustrates just how difficult this kind of evidence can be to interpret with confidence. Researchers working there decades ago recovered fragments of reddened fired clay dating back roughly 1.5 million years and initially proposed them as some of the earliest fire evidence ever found anywhere on the continent. The claim proved deeply controversial almost immediately. Critics pointed out that natural processes, a smouldering tree stump, a termite mound scorched by a passing brush fire, could in principle produce similar reddening without any hominin involvement at all. The debate over that particular site has never fully resolved, and it remains even now a useful caution against reading too much certainty into a single scorched fragment pulled from ancient soil. Fire leaves a trace, but the trace alone rarely tells you who, if anyone, was responsible for lighting it. That distinction matters more than it might first appear, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. For most of this story, the fire our ancestors live alongside is not fire they can create. It is fire they can only borrow carefully, gratefully from a world that offers it up unpredictably and takes it away just as easily through wind or rain. A travelling band might carry a smouldering coal wrapped carefully in bark or damp leaves for days at a time, tending it at every stop the way you might tend something fragile and precious, because losing it could mean waiting months or longer for another lightning strike to offer a fresh one. Entire generations may have lived through long stretches without any fire at all, simply because the last ember, however carefully guarded, finally went out during a river crossing or a stretch of heavy rain, and no substitute presented itself again for a very long time. What would it actually take, do you think, for a creature that has spent its entire existence fleeing from something to instead learn to walk toward it, wrap it gently and carry it home? That reversal quiet and almost impossible to date precisely may be one of the most profound behavioural shifts our lineage ever makes, and it likely happens slowly tested and abandoned and tested again by different groups in different places long before any single group fully understands what they now hold. There is a particular kind of story that tends to circulate about this moment in human history, one that imagines a single dramatic instant when a hominin reaches out and grasps flame for the first time, brave and defiant against the dark. The evidence remains incomplete on almost every detail of how this actually happened, but what we do know suggests something far less cinematic and in its own way far more moving. Someone almost certainly encountered a fire already dying down, already familiar, already less frightening than it had been in its first raging hour, and simply chose not to walk away from the warmth quite as quickly as before. Perhaps a hand was extended toward the heat on an unusually cold night and nothing terrible happened. Perhaps a half-burned branch was picked up out of simple curiosity and found to everyone's evident surprise that it did not need to be dropped immediately. Courage in this particular chapter of the story likely looked less like a single bold decision and more like a long accumulation of small, cautious moments in which fire simply failed to punish anyone for coming a little closer than the last time. One detail from a very different site far to the east in what is now Israel adds an unexpected layer to this picture. Along the shore of an ancient lake, researchers have uncovered repeated evidence of small concentrated burn patches dating back roughly 790,000 years, tightly clustered rather than scattered the way a wildfire would naturally spread. The clustering itself is the telling detail. Wildfires burn broadly and leave broad irregular scars. What survives at this site instead looks like fire returning again and again to the very same small spots, hearth after hearth, layer after layer, stack through time in a way that strongly suggests deliberate repeated use of the same favoured locations across many, many visits. Whoever gathered here was not simply stumbling upon fire occasionally. They were coming back to it, and quite possibly bringing it back to life themselves each time they returned. Not every claim from this era of research has held up quite so well, and it is worth being honest about that too. For much of the last century, a famous cave site in China was celebrated as offering some of the clearest early evidence of fire use anywhere on Earth. Thick reddish layers interpreted for decades as ash from enormous hearths tended across hundreds of thousands of years. Later, more detailed laboratory analysis of those same layers told a more complicated story. Much of what had been confidently labelled as ash turned out under closer chemical and microscopic examination to be naturally decomposed organic sediment, the kind that can form without fire ever entering the picture at all. Some genuine burned material does appear to be present at the site, but nowhere near the scale or the certainty once claimed. It is a useful reminder gently offered that even well-established scientific stories sometimes need to be revisited, and that intellectual honesty occasionally means walking back a claim that once felt entirely secure. Taken together, sites like these sketch out a picture that stretches across an enormous span of time rather than arriving all at once. Different groups in different places at different moments appear to be encountering fire, losing it, and encountering it again, slowly building a relationship with something that remains for now only partly tamed. The fire being kept alive in these early hearths is still not something anyone can summon on command. It is closer to a guest that has agreed tentatively and under the right conditions to stay a while longer than expected. And staying a while longer is enough to change everything that happens next around it. Somewhere on a cold night, much like the ones we have already spent in this story, someone sits close beside a small, carefully guarded fire, feeding it thin, dry twigs one at a time, watching each one catch and glow before reaching for the next. This is not glamorous work. It requires attention through hours when everyone else might rather be asleep, a willingness to wake at intervals through the night simply to check that the coals have not gone grey and cold while no one was watching. It is the kind of unglamorous essential labour that rarely makes it into the story of how humans became human, and yet without someone willing to do exactly this night after night, every fire this species ever manages to keep would eventually gutter out and leave them starting over from nothing. A fire kept burning through a single night, however, modestly changes what that night actually feels like for the people gathered near it. The dark retreats a short distance in every direction. The particular predators who have owned the hours after sunset for as long as anyone can remember hesitate now at the edge of the light, uncertain in a way they've never had reason to be before. For the first time in this entire story, a family does not need to climb into branches and wait tense and half sleeping for morning to arrive. They can sit low to the ground, facing the warmth, and simply watch it burn. There are quieter benefits too easy to overlook beside the drama of predators kept at bay. Smoke drifting low across a camp discourages the biting insects that make sleep miserable and spread illness through a group living in close constant contact with one another. A small fire tended through a cold, wet season can mean the difference between a body that shivers through the night, burning precious energy, simply trying to stay warm, and a body that rests undisturbed, gathering back some of the strength the day already demanded of it. None of these advantages arrive as a single decisive event. They accumulate quietly the way most of the changes in this story tend to one warmer night and one undisturbed sleep at a time. What that changes in the body and the brain, and eventually in the very shape of a human meal, is not something anyone gathered around one of these early fires could have possibly understood. But something in that flickering light is already beginning to work on them quietly, patiently, in ways that will take a very long time still to fully reveal themselves. The body keeps records that no written language ever could. Long after a person's story ends, long after every memory of them has faded from anyone still living, their bones continue quietly reporting what their life actually demanded of them, provided someone eventually learns how to read what is written there. In 1984, along the dry bank of a seasonal river in northern Kenya, a research team uncovered one of the most complete early human skeletons ever found anywhere on Earth, the remains of a boy who died there roughly 1.5 million years ago, at somewhere between 8 and 12 years of age. What makes this particular skeleton so valuable is not simply its age or its completeness, remarkable as both of those are, but what its proportions reveal at a glance. This is not a body built like the heavier, more barrel-chested hominins who came before him. His pelvis is narrower. His ribcage tapers in a way that suggests a slimmer waist and a noticeably smaller gut than his ancestors carried. His legs are long built for covering serious distance efficiently across open ground. Stand this skeleton beside the older, stockier remains discussed earlier in this story, and the difference is immediately visible even to an untrained eye. Something about the digestive demands placed on this body had already begun to ease. That easing did not happen by accident, and it did not happen without cost elsewhere. A body only shrinks an organ as important as the gut if something else is reliably supplying the energy the organ used to work so hard to extract. Fossils alone cannot tell you with certainty what that something was, but there is a compelling case built from chemistry rather than bone for why cooked food fits this role so well. Cooking at its most basic level is a form of digestion that happens outside the body instead of inside it. Heat breaks down tough plant fiber before a single tooth ever meets it. It unravels the tightly folded proteins in raw meat, exposing far more surface area for the body's own digestive enzymes to work on once the food is finally swallowed. Starch. One of the most important energy sources available to any omnivore exists in its raw form as tightly packed granules that the human gut struggles to break open efficiently on its own. Heat and moisture together cause those granules to swell and burst, a transformation cooks today would simply call softening, but which represents at the molecular level an enormous and immediate gift of accessible energy. Researchers who have measured this directly feeding laboratory mice matched portions of the same food, one raw, one cooked, have found that animals fed cooked meat gained noticeably more body mass over the course of the study than animals fed the identical cut of meat raw, despite both groups technically consuming the same number of calories. The same pattern held for starchy foods prepared the two different ways. The food had not changed how much energy it technically contains. It had simply become far easier for a body to actually collect that energy rather than losing much of it undigested before the process ever finishes. This distinction between the energy locked inside a food and the energy a body can actually extract from it turns out to matter enormously, and modern experience offers an unexpectedly clear window into it. A study conducted in Germany some years ago tracked several hundred adults who had chosen as a matter of personal conviction to eat a diet made up almost entirely of raw food. Researchers surveyed how strictly each person followed the practice and then compared that against measures of body weight and reproductive health. Despite consuming what looked on paper like an adequate number of calories, a significant proportion of these individuals showed signs of chronic energy shortfall, unusually low body weight maintained even with what appeared to be sufficient food intake. Among the women in the study, the researchers found a striking pattern: the stricter and more consistently raw. Someone's diet was the more likely she was to experience disrupted or absent menstrual cycles, a response consistent with the body sensing an energy deficit and quietly redirecting resources away from reproduction as a protective measure. None of this reflects a lack of willpower or a flawed diet plan in any simple sense. It reflects something closer to biology, reasserting an old and very literal truth that raw food, however carefully chosen, simply does not release its full caloric promise to a human digestive system built the way ours now is. We changed. The food eaten raw did not change with us. And that observation leads directly into one of the more genuinely unresolved puzzles in this entire field of research, one worth stating honestly rather than smoothing over. The physical changes visible in skeletons like this one, the narrower pelvis, the reduced gut, the smaller teeth appearing across this period, seem to argue for cooked food already playing a significant role in the diet by roughly 1.5 to 2 million years ago. Yet the clearest, most widely accepted archaeological evidence for repeated deliberate fire use that we explored a little earlier in this story does not become truly secure until closer to 1 million years ago, at the very earliest, with confident widespread evidence not really solidifying until several 100,000 years after that. Scholars still debate, sometimes quite pointedly, how to close that gap. Some argue the body evidence should be trusted, and that our methods for detecting very early, very occasional fire use in the archaeological record are simply too blunt an instrument to have caught it yet, meaning fires this old may have existed and simply left no trace we currently know how to find. Others argue the opposite, that anatomy can shift for a combination of reasons beyond diet alone, and that assuming cooking as the single cause risks working backward from a tidy story rather than from the fossils themselves. The evidence remains incomplete, and honestly it may stay that way for a long time yet. This is one of those places where the true answer likely lies somewhere in a messy, complicated middle ground that no single dramatic discovery has fully mapped out. There is a quieter thread here too, one that reaches back to a very different part of this body's story. We spent time earlier with the curved tree-gripping fingers that let earlier hominins disappear safely into branches each night, a compromise between walking upright by day and climbing for survival after dark. Look at the hands belonging to the boy from that riverbank in Kenya, and the curve has largely straightened out. The fingers are longer, straighter, more like the hands we carry today than like the branch-gripping hands of his more ancient relatives. Scholars still debate how directly to connect this particular change to fire and cooked food, specifically since many pressures were likely acting on this body at once. But the timing lines up suggestively. A body less dependent on nightly refuge in the treetops, guarded instead by firelight, and a group willing to keep watch has correspondingly less need for hands built primarily for climbing. Committing to the ground and committing to the hearth may in the end have been closely related decisions made not all at once, but pressure by pressure, generation by generation, until the choice was no longer really a choice at all. One more marker deserves mention here, subtle but telling in its own way. Compare the size difference between male and female skeletons from earlier hominin populations, and it is often substantial males considerably larger and more heavily built than females of the same species, a pattern common among primates where competition between males for mates favours size and strength above almost everything else. Among the population this Kenyan boy belonged to, that gap narrows noticeably. Males and females grow closer in size than their ancestors had been. Researchers studying this shift offer several possible explanations, and no single one commands universal agreement. One reasonably supported idea holds that a more reliable energy-dense diet reduces the advantage of simply being larger, since survival depends less on brute physical dominance and more on the kind of flexible cooperative behavior that a well-fed group can more easily sustain. It is a modest piece of evidence on its own, easy to overlook, but laid alongside the smaller teeth, the narrower gut, and the straightening hands, it adds one more thread to a body quietly reorganizing itself around a new and gentler kind of survival. Whatever the precise timeline turns out to be, the direction of the change itself is not seriously in question. Teeth become smaller and less heavily built across this period, no longer needing the massive grinding surfaces earlier hominins relied on for hour after hour of raw fibrous food. Jaw muscles shrink correspondingly, and with them some of the heavy bony ridges across the skull that once anchored. Those muscles begin to soften and disappear. It is worth asking gently what it must have felt like to be among the first generations living inside these changing bodies, a jaw simply no longer built for the punishing raw diet their own grandparents managed every single day without complaint. Did it feel like relief? Did it feel in some quiet physical sense like vulnerability? A body no longer quite as equipped to fall back on the old way of eating if the new way ever failed them? We cannot know for certain. But the anatomy itself suggests a species increasingly and perhaps irreversibly committing to a new relationship with food. There is one more piece of this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it has nothing to do with jaws or guts at all. A softer, more energy-dense diet does something subtle to the demands placed on a growing child, and childhood itself is where some of the most consequential changes in this story eventually take root. An infant weaned earlier than its raw food-eating ancestors fed food that has already been softened and partly broken down by heat before it ever reaches a small mouth, with only a handful of teeth, requires less of its mother's own body to bridge the gap between milk and solid food. That single shift, small and practical as it sounds, frees a mother to have her next child sooner, to recover her own strength faster, to keep contributing to the group's survival without carrying quite as heavy a physical burden for quite as long. None of this shows up as a single dramatic fossil. It shows up instead as a slow compounding demographic advantage, the kind that, given enough generations, quietly outcompetes almost anything else evolution has to offer. Picture, if you will, one particular evening built around exactly this shift. A mother sits near a low fire working a piece of tuber that has already spent time in the coals, mashing it further between two flat stones until it reaches something close to a paste. Her youngest child, too small yet for solid meat, takes this softened mouthful, eagerly needing none of the long patient chewing that would have been required only a few generations earlier. She herself eats less that evening than her own mother might have needed at the same age, because the food in front of her gives up its energy more easily than it once did. It is an unremarkable scene, almost too quiet to notice, and it is also in its own understated way one of the moments this entire story has been slowly building toward. None of these changes, the body, the teeth, the freed up time for mothers and children alike, would mean very much on their own if they simply stopped there. But they do not stop there. Something else in the body is quietly taking advantage of all this newly available energy, something that has been waiting in a sense for exactly this kind of opportunity for a very long time. Every bargain, even a good one, tends to close a door somewhere behind it. This is the part of the story where that door finally swings shut quietly without ceremony, and the species walking through it can never fully step back the way it came. By the time we reach the descendants of that boy from the Kenyan riverbank, something has begun accelerating that had crept forward only slowly for the entire span of this story until now. Brain size, which had inched upward across earlier generations almost imperceptibly, starts climbing at a noticeably faster pace. The boy himself likely carried a brain somewhere in the range of 900 cubic centimeters, already larger than his more ancient ancestors, but still well short of what was coming. Populations living roughly 700,000 to 400,000 years ago, a group researchers generally place in a separate, somewhat later branch of the human family tree, carry brains averaging closer to 12 or 1300 cubic centimeters a jump, substantial enough that placed side by side, the two skulls would look as though they belonged to entirely different kinds of creature, rather than distant relatives separated by a comparatively short stretch of evolutionary time. That growth did not happen because evolution suddenly decided brains were worth the cost. It happened because for the first time in this entire story, the energy to actually afford one was reliably available, arriving each evening in the form of a softened root, a roasted joint of meat, a meal that gave up its calories easily instead of extracting hours of grinding labour first. But affording something and depending on it are two very different relationships, and this is where the bargain reveals its true terms. A body that builds an organ this expensive does not keep it in reserve for emergencies. It commits to it, fully restructuring nearly everything else to support the arrangement. And a body that shrinks its jaw, narrows its gut, and reduces its molars generation after generation, freed by the reliable presence of cooked food, eventually reaches a point where those older, more robust systems are simply no longer there to fall back on. The raw diet that once sustained every single ancestor in this story, however painfully, is no longer a diet this body can actually survive on for long. Not because willpower fails, because the physical machinery required to extract enough energy from unprocessed food has been quietly permanently dismantled in favor of something else. Is it strange to think of evolution as capable of making a bargain it cannot undo? In a sense, every major adaptation works this way, trading one form of flexibility for another, but few examples in the story of our own species illustrate it as starkly as this one. A chimpanzee, our closest living relative, could in principle return to nothing but raw food indefinitely, and continue much as it always has because it never left that arrangement in any permanent sense. We no longer have that option. Somewhere in the last 2 million years, cooking stopped being a convenience layered on top of an already viable raw diet, and became quietly and without anyone at the time realizing it the floor beneath which this species could no longer safely fall. There is a strange, almost overlooked piece of physical evidence for just how far this commitment runs, and it has nothing to do with teeth or gut length at all. Researchers comparing stomach acidity across a wide range of mammals have found that human stomach acid sits at a level of strength typically associated not with omnivores in general, but specifically with animals that regularly eat carrion scavengers like vultures and hyenas, whose stomachs need to be acidic enough to destroy the dangerous bacteria that build up in meat left exposed for hours or days in open heat. Our stomachs, by this measure, are closer in strength to a vulture's than to a typical plant-eating or even meat-eating mammal, living a more conventional lifestyle. The comparison holds up across a wide range of species measured this way, from strict herbivores with relatively mild stomach acid to typical carnivores somewhere in the middle, to the small handful of dedicated scavengers sitting at the most acidic extreme, and it is in that extreme category, oddly enough, that our own species lands. Scholars still debate exactly which chapter of our history is responsible for this particular trait. Whether it reflects the long scavenging period we spent gathering meat from carcasses other predators had already claimed, or a later period of eating meat that had already begun to spoil before it could be cooked and consumed. Either way, it stands as a quiet, permanent souvenir carried inside every one of us today, a physical reminder that comfort and convenience were never really the terms this bargain was struck on. Survival was, and the body still carries the scars of exactly how difficult that survival once was, long after the circumstances that demanded them have faded into deep history. What makes this turning point so easy to miss even now is that nothing about it would have felt sudden or dramatic to the people actually living through it. No single generation experiences the door swinging shut behind them. Grandparents in this era may have grown up eating slightly tougher, less processed food than their grandchildren ever would, and neither generation would necessarily notice the gap as anything more than ordinary variation, the kind every family experiences without remark. It is only from a great distance, looking back across hundreds of thousands of years the way we are tonight, that the pattern becomes visible as a single continuous slope, rather than a series of unremarkable small steps. And yet the consequences of crossing that threshold ripple outward into nearly every part of how this species now has to live. A group that depends on fire to make its food digestible cannot simply wander wherever hunger or curiosity leads without also solving the much harder logistical problem of keeping that fire, or the ability to relight one, close at hand. Camps likely begin organizing themselves increasingly around a central hearth rather than scattering loosely across a landscape the way earlier, more nomadic bands may have. Knowledge about how to tend a fire, which woods burn longest, which kindling catches easiest, how to shelter a flame from wind and rain, becomes something worth teaching deliberately to the next generation, because a group that loses this knowledge does not simply lose a convenience, it loses its ability to eat. Picture an evening built around exactly this new fragility. A hearth burns low after a long day of travel, and an older member of the group, someone who has tended fires for decades and lost more than a few to storms and river crossings over the years, kneels close to the coals, coaxing a stubborn flame back to life with patient, practiced breath. Nearby, a child watches closely, memorizing, without quite realizing it, the particular angle of the kneeling, the particular way dry grass is fed in before thicker branches follow. This is not idle curiosity. It is the quiet, essential transfer of a skill. The entire group's survival now depends on past the same unglamorous way most truly important knowledge tends to pass hand to hand, generation to generation, around a fire that can never quite be allowed to fully go out. What that newly available energy actually allowed a population to accomplish is not left entirely to speculation. At a site in what is now Germany, researchers digging through the preserved mud of an ancient lakeshore recovered a set of wooden hunting spears roughly 300,000 years old, remarkably intact after being sealed for millennia in oxygen-poor sediment that kept the wood from rotting away the way it normally would. These are not crude sharpened sticks. They are carefully balanced, aerodynamically shaped throwing weapons weighted toward the front, the way a modern javelin is designed by people who clearly understood through long practical experience exactly how a spear needs to be built to fly true across real distance. Found alongside the butchered remains of dozens of wild horses, they suggest organized cooperative hunting on a scale that would have been almost unthinkable for the exhausted, raw food-dependent populations who opened this story so many generations earlier. None of this happens without spare capacity, time, and energy left over after the basic work of survival, the very surplus this bargain was built to generate in the first place. There is a real cost buried inside this dependency, and it deserves to be named honestly rather than romanticized. A group that loses its fire during a difficult season through misfortune, through conflict, through simple bad luck, faces a crisis that earlier, more raw food-adapted ancestors would never have confronted in quite the same way. Imagine such a group caught by days of relentless rain that finally soaks through even the most carefully guarded coals, leaving nothing behind but cold, wet ash. The meat they carry, tough and unyielding without heat to soften it, now demands far more from jaws and guts that have spent generations growing smaller and less capable of managing exactly this kind of raw, resistant food. Children struggle hardest of all their smaller teeth and shorter digestive systems, even less prepared than adults for a sudden, forced return to the old way of eating. It is not an exaggeration to say that a lost fire in this era could tip a struggling group from hardship into genuine crisis within a matter of days rather than seasons. The evidence remains incomplete on how often this actually happened, since a lost fire leaves no fossil of its own, no burned bone or ash layer to mark the absence. But the logic of the bodies we have been tracing across this entire story leaves little room for doubt that it did happen more than once to more than one struggling group somewhere across the long dark stretch of this era. What the bargain offers in return, though, is not small. A species finally freed at least partially from the 6-hour daily grind of chewing that shaped every single ancestor in this story until now. A brain large enough to begin doing things no earlier hominin brain had room to attempt planning, further ahead, remembering more eventually, imagining things that had never yet existed in the world at all. Children raised on softer, more efficient food, free to grow, to play, to learn for years longer than their ancestors' harder, more grinding daily survival ever allowed. Childhood itself, in fact, appears to stretch longer across this same period, years added onto the slow process of growing up that earlier, more energy-strapped populations simply could not have afforded to extend. A longer childhood means more years spent learning rather than merely surviving, more time for an older relative to demonstrate exactly how a spear should be balanced, or exactly how a stubborn coal should be coaxed back into flame before that knowledge is ever needed in earnest. None of this arrives as a gift handed down all at once. It arrives the way nearly everything in this story does, slowly, unevenly, earned across centuries rather than granted in a single generous instant. The old bargain closes one door, but it opens onto a room far larger than anything that came before it, filled with possibilities that no earlier version of this story had ever been wealthy enough in simple caloric terms to afford. What exactly filled that newly opened room, and how quickly is where the story turns next carried forward by bones and ash and teeth that have waited a very long time for someone to finally read what they have been quietly recording all along. Teeth remember things their owners never wrote down, long after a person's name is lost, long after every custom and belief they carried has vanished from memory entirely. A thin, hardened film clinging stubbornly to the surface of their molars can still hold locked inside it the actual last meals that pass through their mouth. That film is dental calculus, the same substance a dentist scrapes carefully away from your own teeth during a routine cleaning, built up slowly over a lifetime from minerals in saliva, combining with whatever food debris happens to be trapped nearby at the time. In most contexts, it is simply an unpleasant nuisance, unremarkable and easily ignored. In the hands of researchers studying ancient remains, it becomes something closer to a sealed accidental time capsule. Trapped inside these hardened deposits preserved for tens of thousands of years, in a way that softer, more perishable evidence almost never survives, are microscopic starch granules. Tiny fragments of plant tissue, occasionally even traces of smoke residue, all of it waiting quietly for someone with the right microscope and the right question to finally notice it was there at all. Researchers examining calculus recovered from Neanderthal remains at cave sites in Belgium and Spain have found exactly this kind of preserved plant material clinging to teeth tens of thousands of years old. And what they found inside those tiny fragments is genuinely striking. Some of the starch granules show the distinctive swollen, cracked structure that only forms when starch has been heated. The same physical transformation we discussed earlier, as central to why cooked food releases its energy so much more easily than raw food does. Neanderthals living in these particular regions, it turns out, were not simply eating meat cooked over a fire while leaving plants raw and unprocessed on the side. They were cooking root vegetables and grains as well, incorporating heat into a genuinely varied, deliberately prepared diet, rather than treating fire as a tool reserved for meat alone. One individual examined this way, recovered from a cave in northern Spain, offered researchers something even more unexpected than cooked starch alone. Preserved in the calculus clinging to this particular Neanderthal's teeth were traces of chamomile and yarrow, two plants that carry a notably bitter taste and offer little in the way of straightforward nutrition, yet have long been used across many human cultures for their medicinal properties. Bitter low-calorie plants are an odd thing to find preserved in the teeth of a species already working hard to secure enough energy to survive, unless those plants were being sought out for a different reason entirely. Researchers studying this particular case have suggested carefully, and without overstating the certainty involved, that this individual may have been self-medicating, deliberately seeking out plants understood through some accumulated practical knowledge to ease illness or discomfort rather than to fill an empty stomach. It is a small, quietly moving detail easy to miss inside a broader story about calories and survival that even a species so thoroughly defined in the popular imagination by brute physical hardship may also have been capable of this kind of careful, deliberate self-care. Is it strange to imagine a Neanderthal of all creatures tending a small pot of roasting roots the same unglamorous way you might roast vegetables in your own kitchen tonight? For a very long time, popular imagination cast Neanderthals as crude, brutish, and narrowly carnivorous, a caricature that recent research keeps quietly, patiently dismantling piece by piece. The calculus evidence adds one more piece to that correction, suggesting a level of culinary knowledge, which plants soften well with heat, which need longer cooking, which are worth the effort of gathering and preparing, at all that had to be learned, tested, and passed down deliberately across generations, the same way any genuinely useful body of practical knowledge tends to survive. Scholars still debate how representative these particular sites are of Neanderthal diet. More broadly, since preserved calculus tends to survive better in certain climates and soil conditions than others, meaning the sample available to study today may not perfectly reflect what every Neanderthal population across their entire range actually ate. Some researchers have also raised a more technical caution, noting that a handful of starch granules recovered from ancient calculus can occasionally be difficult to distinguish with total certainty from contamination introduced during excavational storage, even with careful laboratory protocols in place. The evidence remains incomplete in exactly the way honest science usually is, suggestive and compelling rather than absolutely conclusive on every point. But taken as a whole alongside everything else this story has already traced through bone and stone, the picture holds together consistently. Cooking by this point in the timeline is not a rare or occasional practice, it is simply how a meal gets made. There is another layer to this story that has nothing to do with food at all, and it may be the most surprising detail in this entire chapter. Along the southern coast of what is now South Africa, researchers excavating a cave overlooking the ocean discovered something unexpected. Buried among stone tool fragments dating back roughly 164,000 years. The stone itself, a fine-grained rock called silkrete, is difficult to shape into a sharp, reliable tool in its natural state, brittle and unpredictable when struck. But heat applied carefully, and for a sustained period at a specific controlled temperature, changes its internal structure in a way that makes it flake far more easily and produce a noticeably sharper, more consistent edge. The tools recovered from this cave show clear evidence of exactly this kind of deliberate heat treatment, meaning someone tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before pottery, before almost anything we associate with sophisticated technology, had already learned to use fire, not simply to cook a meal, but to reshape the physical properties of stone itself. Think about what that actually requires. Cooking food demands attention and patience, but a reasonable margin for error. A slightly undercooked root is disappointing rather than ruined. Heat treating stone for tool making demands something closer to real technical precision. A fire built and maintained at a controlled temperature for hours at a time, likely buried beneath sand or ash to regulate the heat, evenly followed by a careful gradual cooling period before the stone can finally be worked. Get any part of that process wrong, and the stone cracks uselessly instead of improving. This is not campfire cooking. This is early engineering, patient and exacting, built entirely around a resource that not so very long before, in this same story, an ancestor several 100,000 years earlier would only have dared to approach from a careful, frightened distance. Picture someone at this particular cave overlooking the ocean, kneeling beside a shallow pit dug into the sand well away from where the group actually sleeps and eats. Raw stone cobbles gathered earlier from a nearby outcrop sit buried beneath a bed of glowing coals, and a further layer of sand packed carefully on top, holding the heat steady rather than letting it flare and fade the way an open flame would. There is nothing to do now but wait hours at a stretch, tending the coals, occasionally resisting any temptation to dig the stones out too soon, simply to see how they are progressing, because disturbing the process early ruins it completely. Only after the fire has burned down and the whole buried arrangement has cooled slowly overnight does anyone finally uncover the stones again, testing a few experimental strikes against each one to see which have taken the treatment well. This is not the frantic, dramatic labour most people imagine when they picture prehistoric survival. It is closer to something quieter, and in its own understated way more impressive. Patient, deliberate craftsmanship practiced by people willing to invest a full day's effort into a result they would not see until the following morning. The discovery itself is worth pausing on for a moment, since figuring out that ancient stone had been deliberately heat-treated is considerably harder than simply noticing a burned bone lying near a hearth. Heat-treated silkcrete does not announce itself obviously to the naked eye. Researchers first grew suspicious after noticing a particular glossy sheen and subtle colour shift on certain finished tools that did not quite match the natural unheated stone found in the same region. To confirm the suspicion, they turned to experimental archaeology, gathering raw silkcrete themselves, burying it under coals and sand in carefully controlled conditions, then comparing the resulting stone directly against the ancient tools under a microscope. The match was unmistakable. Only then could researchers say with real confidence that the ancient toolmakers had not simply stumbled onto slightly better stone by luck. They had engineered it deliberately through a process invisible to anyone who did not already know exactly what to look for. This same coastal stretch of South Africa has produced other evidence from roughly the same broad window of time that fits neatly alongside the picture of a species growing steadily more sophisticated in how it manipulates its environment. Pigments, careful patterns etched into shell and stone, deliberately shaped beads, all begin appearing in the archaeological record here in ways that suggest more than simple survival is now on people's minds. Scholars still debate exactly how tightly to link fire mastery specifically to this broader flowering of symbolic and technological behaviour, since many capacities were almost certainly developing together, rather than one simply causing the others in a tidy linear sequence. But it is difficult to look at a population confident enough to bury stone in a fire pit for an entire day, trusting a process they cannot see or check until morning, and not sense a mind already comfortable with delayed reward. Careful planning, and the kind of patient experimentation that symbolic thought and complex technology both seem to require in equal measure. The two threads sit together rather beautifully once you notice them side by side. On one hand, fire quietly transforming a root vegetable into something a mouth can digest more easily. On the other, that very same fire transforming a brittle stone into a sharper, more reliable tool. Different applications entirely separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles of coastline and cave, yet both resting on the same underlying discovery that heat does not simply destroy or consume the things it touches. Handled with enough patience and accumulated knowledge, it can improve them instead, coaxing out qualities that were never available in the raw, untouched material to begin with. It is worth pausing on how much accumulated trial and observation this kind of knowledge actually demands. No single person invents heat-treated stone tools or reliably cooked tubers in a single afternoon of clever improvisation. Both skills almost certainly emerge the same slow, patient way most durable human knowledge does, through generations of small failures quietly absorbed and corrected. A fire left burning slightly too long here, a batch of stone ruined by uneven cooling, their each mistake feeding forward into the next attempt until what remains stands passed down carefully from one set of hands to the next finally works reliably enough to be worth teaching on purpose. What these two very different discoveries share beneath the surface is something worth carrying with you as this story continues. Fire by this point is no longer merely tolerated or carefully managed out of necessity. It has become something closer to a genuine collaborator, patiently studied, deliberately shaped, applied with increasing precision toward whatever problem happens to be in front of a person at the time. And once a species starts treating fire this way as a tool to be refined, rather than simply a danger to be endured, there is very little left in its daily life that fire will not eventually find some way to touch. Sooner or later, every shattered thread eventually needs someone willing to sit down and ask what it all actually adds up to. All the bones, the ash layers, the stomach acid, the softened roots, the swollen starch, grains trapped in an ancient teeth. None of it assembles itself into a coherent story on its own. It takes a particular kind of patient, occasionally stubborn attention sustained over years to look at evidence this scattered and finally propose a single idea capable of holding it all together. The scientist most closely associated with doing exactly that spent years long before formulating anything resembling a formal theory, simply watching wild chimpanzees eat. Working for extended stretches in the forests of Uganda, observing troop after troop chew through the same tough fibrous foods for hour upon hour each day, he found himself circling a question that seems almost obvious in hindsight, yet had gone strangely underexplored for decades within his own field. Mornings in that forest apparently followed a familiar, almost monotonous rhythm, chimpanzees settling into fig trees or patches of wild fruit and simply working their jaws steadily for hours at a stretch, pausing occasionally to rest before resuming again an entire day, organised almost entirely around the sheer physical labour of processing enough calories to survive. Watching this pattern repeat itself day after day, season after season, eventually crystallised into a very specific comparison. If our closest living relatives spend nearly half their waking hours simply processing raw food and human beings spend almost none of theirs doing the same thing. What exactly changed and when to create a gap that wide between two species separated by a comparatively short stretch of evolutionary time? Most researchers before him had assumed the answer lay primarily in meat that hunting and the nutrient density of animal flesh explained the difference on their own. He began to suspect the answer lay somewhere else, instead, not in what our ancestors ate, but in what they did to it before eating it at all. The theory that eventually emerged from this line of thinking, formally proposed and laid out at length in a widely read book published in 2009, argues that cooking itself more than meat eating, more than tool use, more than any other single behavioural shift in this entire long story was the decisive turning point that made the modern human body and brain possible. Cooking in this framing is not simply one convenient technique among many that early humans happened to pick up along the way. It is the specific innovation that broke open the energy ceiling ever earlier. Hominin in this story had been straining helplessly against freeing enough surplus calories to finally afford a brain of the size and expense we carry today, while simultaneously reshaping the gut, the teeth and the jaw in exactly the directions the fossil record shows them actually moving. It's worth sitting for a moment with how genuinely different this idea is from what came before it, because the shift in thinking runs deeper than it might first appear. For much of the last century, the dominant story of human origin centered heavily on hunting itself, the image of an early human ancestor becoming human specifically through the act of pursuing killing and consuming large protein-rich prey with meat, cast as the primary engine behind our growing brains and shrinking guts. That story is not wrong exactly. Meat clearly does matter enormously across this entire narrative, as we've already seen. But the cooking-centered theory argues that meat alone eaten raw could never have delivered enough usable energy to explain what actually happened to the human body. A large, dangerous animal killed and eaten completely raw still demands significant chewing and still yields meaningfully less usable energy than the same animal eaten cooked. The researcher behind this theory and a colleague went further than simply proposing the idea in general terms. They attempted to calculate using known figures for the energy density of raw wild foods and the chewing rates observed in living primates roughly how many hours a modern human would need to spend chewing each day to meet our actual caloric needs on a diet of entirely raw, unprocessed food of the kind available to early hominins. Their estimate came out to somewhere in the range of 9 to 11 hours of continuous chewing daily, a figure that laid beside an ordinary modern day sounds almost impossible to imagine fitting alongside anything else a life might require. No time left for extended travel, Very little left for childcare beyond the most basic supervision. Almost nothing left over for the kind of complex tool use, social interaction, or unhurried thought that this story has been slowly tracing across every part that came before this one. The critical transformation on this account was never simply acquiring better food. It was learning to unlock food that had already been acquired, extracting far more from exactly the same resources our ancestors had always had available to them, and buying back in the process nearly an entire working day's worth of time that raw chewing alone would otherwise have consumed completely. Is it strange that something as ordinary as heating food before eating it could rival or even exceed the importance of hunting itself in shaping an entire species? Perhaps it is, and that strangeness is precisely what made the theory controversial from the moment it was first proposed. Critics within the same field of research raised the objection we ourselves have already sat with earlier in this story, that the archaeological evidence for widespread reliable fire use does not become truly secure until long after the body changes. The theory depends on had already begun appearing in the fossil record. If cooking caused the shrinking gut and the growing brain, the reasoning goes, then secure evidence of fire ought to appear at roughly the same time as those changes, and for many specialists that evidence still does not. Scholars still debate this gap vigorously, and it remains even now the single most significant challenge facing the theory as originally proposed. Some researchers have proposed a kind of compromise position, suggesting that our methods for detecting very early sporadic fire use are simply too blunt to have caught it reliably, yet meaning the archaeological silence may reflect the limits of what survives and what we know how to look for rather than genuine absence. Others remain unconvinced, arguing that the body changes in question could plausibly stem from other pressures acting on the digestive system and skeleton. During this period, changes in the types of raw food available, increased reliance on mechanically processed food using the stone tools we discussed earlier, or some combination of causes working together rather than cooking alone carrying the entire explanatory weight. The honest position, and the one most careful researchers in this space tend to hold today, is that cooking almost certainly played a major role in shaping the human body we now carry, while the precise timeline connecting that role to the archaeological record remains a genuinely open question, not a settled one. Support for the broader theory has arrived somewhat unexpectedly from an entirely different branch of science altogether. Researchers comparing human genetics to that of chimpanzees have found that humans carry considerably more copies of a particular gene responsible for producing amylase, an enzyme present in saliva that begins breaking starch down into sugar the moment food enters the mouth, well before it ever reaches the stomach. Chimpanzees carry far fewer copies of this same gene, consistent with a diet that historically relied less heavily on starch-rich foods requiring this kind of rapid mouth-based digestion. Extra copies of a gene like this do not appear in a population by accident. They spread because they offer some meaningful survival advantage in this case, almost certainly a heightened ability to extract energy quickly from exactly the kind of starchy cooked tubers and grains this story has already spent considerable time describing. It is a small, easily overlooked detail buried deep in our own cells, and yet it tells the same story as the bones and the ash and the calculus already examined, that the human body has spent an enormous span of evolutionary time quietly rebuilding itself around a diet that heat has already begun transforming before it ever reaches the mouth at all. There is a second, quieter piece of the theory that tends to attract less attention than the biology, yet may be just as significant in its own way. Cooking a meal, unlike gathering or scavenging raw food eaten more or less on the spot, takes time, requires returning to a fixed location where fire is kept, and benefits enormously from the labour being shared rather than duplicated by every single member of a group individually. The theory proposes that this practical reality likely encouraged a new kind of division of labor and cooperation around food. Certain individuals gathering fuel and tending the fire, others foraging or hunting. The results eventually brought back and shared communally around a single hearth, rather than consumed piecemeal wherever each person happened to find their own meal. Imagine what this actually reorganizes about a group's entire day, rather than each person wandering independently from dawn until dusk, eating whatever they happen to find the moment they find it, the way a foraging chimpanzee still does today. A hearth gives a group a fixed point to return to a shared destination that reshapes the whole rhythm of daily movement around it. Someone tends the fire and prepares whatever has already been gathered, while others range further afield confident that a meal and warmth and safety will be waiting when they finally make their way back before dark. That kind of arrangement asks for a level of trust and coordination that a purely solitary opportunistic feeding pattern never required each person's contribution, only paying off later once shared rather than immediately the moment food is found. Whether this specific arrangement looked the way the theory imagines it and how consistently it applied across different groups and different periods remains like so much else in this story, an area of active ongoing discussion among specialists rather than settled fact. But the underlying logic is difficult to dismiss entirely. A meal that requires a fire fuel and time to prepare properly is almost by definition a meal built around sharing rather than solitary consumption, and a species that begins organizing its most basic daily need around a shared fire is a species already in some small but meaningful way practicing the kind of cooperation that so much of what comes later in human history will eventually depend on. What makes an idea like this worth sitting with tonight is not that it resolves every question cleanly, because it plainly does not. It is that it offers a way of holding an enormous amount of scattered, genuinely difficult evidence bones and ash and stomach acid and starch grains trapped in ancient teeth inside a single coherent shape without requiring any of that evidence to be exaggerated or forced into place. Good scientific ideas rarely arrive as finished, unassailable truths. They arrive as reasonable, well-supported proposals sturdy enough to organize a field's thinking for years, honest enough to invite serious challenge and useful enough to keep pulling new evidence into conversation with everything that came before it. And there is more evidence still waiting in that conversation, evidence that comes not from Africa or Europe this time, but from a very different part of the world entirely, where a separate group of researchers working with almost none of this same theory in mind at the time stumbled onto findings that would eventually complicate and enrich this story even further. Some of the most important discoveries in this entire field arrive not from a spectacular skeleton pulled dramatically from the ground, but from something almost embarrassingly small, easy to overlook, sitting quietly in a drawer for years before anyone realizes what it actually is. In a cave tucked into the forested mountains of southern Siberia, researchers had been excavating for decades, recovering the ordinary expected mix of stone tools, animal bones, and scattered human remains, typical of any long-occupied prehistoric site. Among the finds in a layer roughly 50,000 years old sat a single small bone fragment from a child's finger, unremarkable enough by itself that it might easily have been catalogued boxed and largely forgotten. Only when researchers extracted and sequenced deep ancient genetic material from that tiny fragment did something extraordinary come into focus. The genome did not match Neanderthals. It did not match modern humans either. It belonged to an entirely separate, previously unknown population of ancient humans later named simply for the cave in which that single finger bone was found, a lineage that genetics alone had revealed. Years before anyone had recovered enough of an actual skeleton to know what these people even looked like. This detail alone is worth sitting with for a moment because it reflects something genuinely surprising about how the study of ancient humans has changed in recent years. For most of this story so far, our evidence has come from bones, teeth, ash, and stone things you can hold in your hand and examine directly. This particular discovery came instead from strands of genetic code too small and fragile to see. Without extraordinarily sensitive laboratory equipment extracted from a bone, so unassuming that an earlier generation of researchers might reasonably have walked right past its significance entirely. An entire branch of the human family tree unknown to science until barely more than a decade ago was sitting quietly in storage the whole time, waiting for the right technology and the right question to finally notice what it actually held. The same cave would go on to offer one more discovery almost too remarkable to seem real. Among later finds recovered from these layers, researchers identified a single bone fragment no longer than a couple of centimeters belonging to a young girl who died at around 13 years of age. When her genome was sequenced, the pattern researchers found was unlike anything else recovered from this site before or since. Roughly half her genetic material matched Neanderthal populations known from sites much further west, while the other half matched this newly identified Siberian population, instead split so cleanly down the middle that researchers could say with real confidence this was not simply someone descended from mixed ancestry many generations back. Her mother, the genetic evidence showed clearly, was a Neanderthal. Her father belonged to this separate newly identified population. She was, in other words, a direct, first-generation product of two distinct branches of the human family, meeting and mixing in this exact stretch of Siberian forest evidence, not simply that these different kinds of ancient humans coexisted in the same region, but that they occasionally formed families together, an intimacy that no fossil skeleton alone could ever have revealed quite so directly. The genetic legacy of that same population, distant as it might seem from anything happening in your own life tonight, has not entirely vanished either. Researchers studying modern human populations across parts of Asia and the Pacific Islands have found measurable traces of this same ancient lineage's genetic material still present today, inherited through countless generations of descent. Among certain populations living at extreme high altitude on the Tibetan Plateau, one particular gene variant that helps the body use oxygen more efficiently in thin mountain air appears to have been inherited directly from this same ancient Siberian population. A genetic gift passed down across tens of thousands of years that continues quietly helping people breathe more easily at elevations that would leave most of the rest of us gasping. Scholars still debate exactly how many separate instances of interbreeding between these populations actually occurred, and how widely this genetic exchange spread beyond the specific groups tested so far since the sample of ancient genomes recovered remains small relative to the vast populations and timespans actually involved. But the broader picture holds regardless of those remaining uncertainties. The line separating one ancient human population from another was evidently far more permeable in practice than the neat separate categories scientists use to describe them today might suggest. What does any of this have to do with fire and cooking? You might reasonably ask. So far from the African savanna and the Mediterranean coastlines, this story has spent most of its time exploring until now. The answer lies in where exactly this cave, known simply by the name of the small mountain range surrounding it, sits on the map. Southern Siberia experiences winters of a severity that would be almost unsurvivable for a body without significant help temperatures regularly dropping to levels that make simple heat retention, rather than mere comfort, a matter of basic survival. Researchers examining the hearth remain scattered through this cave's many occupation layers, spanning an enormous stretch of time, and multiple different hominin populations have found repeated sustained evidence of fire use, stretching back well over 100,000 years, layer after layer of ash charcoal and burned bones stacked one atop another as different groups return to this same sheltered space again and again across an almost unimaginable span of generations. Using a technique that examines soil at the microscopic level, researchers have identified more than 100 separate distinguishable burning events preserved within the cave's layered floor, each one a discrete occasion when someone built a fire on that exact spot. Let it burn and eventually let it go cold before the accumulating dust and debris of ordinary cave life buried it and made room for the next occupant, sometimes generations later, to build another fire in almost exactly the same place. Cold climates change the entire caloric equation this story has been tracing from the very beginning. A body working simply to maintain its own core temperature through a Siberian winter burns through energy at a far higher rate than the same body would need in the warmer climates most of this story has taken place in so far. Researchers studying the physical build of the hominin populations who lived across this same broad region and era describe bodies notably more compact and heavily built than their counterparts further south, shorter limbs relative to torso size, in a pattern that mirrors what many cold-adapted mammals independently evolve an efficient way of conserving heat by reducing the body's overall surface area relative to its mass. Estimates of daily energy requirements for populations living under these conditions run considerably higher than for those living in milder climates, in some calculations reaching several thousand calories a day, simply to maintain normal function through a long, harsh winter. Every advantage cooking offers the extra calories extracted from the same food. The reduced time spent chewing the surplus energy freed up for a larger brain becomes correspondingly more valuable and arguably more essential the further a population pushes into genuinely cold resource-scarce environments. Scholars still debate exactly how dependent on fire these particular populations were for basic survival at this latitude. Since clothing shelter design and other adaptations we have not yet fully reconstructed from the archaeological record likely played a significant supporting role alongside fire itself. But it is difficult to imagine any population maintaining a permanent presence this far north across so many thousands of years without a fire they could reliably create, tend and depend on through the coldest months. Not every detail of daily life in that cave is settled, and it is worth naming the uncertainty honestly rather than smoothing over it. Researchers still debate whether these populations occupied the cave continuously through the harshest winter months or retreated seasonally to lower, milder ground before returning again once conditions eased, since distinguishing a single long occupation from several shorter repeated visits within the same layer of soil is genuinely difficult work. Wear patterns on recovered teeth, the presence or absence of certain seasonally available plant and animal remains, and the sheer density of accumulated debris in different layers all offer partial clues, but none of them settle the question definitively on their own. What the evidence does make reasonably clear is that whichever pattern of occupation these populations actually followed, fire itself was a fixture of it, present in layer after layer, regardless of exactly how the surrounding seasonal rhythm played out. Picture for a moment what a single winter night inside this cave might actually have felt like. Outside temperatures plunge far below anything survivable for long, without shelter snow piling silently against rock walls worn smooth by generations of previous occupants, the wind finding every gap in the cave mouth and turning it into a low, constant howl that never quite stops for the length of the season. Inside, a fire burns steadily at the centre of a space already thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, its light throwing long shadows across walls that have sheltered fires like this one for longer than anyone gathered there could possibly imagine. Furs and hides carefully scraped and softened over days of patient work line whatever ground is not already occupied by stone and sleeping bodies. Children sleep close to the warmth, wrapped in hides prepared by hands that learned the skill from someone else's hands decades earlier in this same cave. The whole arrangement, a kind of inherited architecture of survival, refined slightly by each generation before being passed on again to the next. It is easy lying warm in your own bed tonight to underestimate just how much of what allowed a family to survive. A night like this rested on nothing more sophisticated than a well-tended pile of burning wood faithfully maintained night after night for longer than written history itself can account for. There is a quiet, almost startling thought worth pausing on here. Two different kinds of ancient human distinct enough in their overall biology and history to be classified today as entirely separate populations, nonetheless arrived at exactly the same solution to the same brutal Siberian winter, tending fire in the same cave, likely using broadly similar techniques passed down across their own respective generations. Whatever separated these two lineages in other ways, and researchers still have much to learn about exactly how different their lives and cultures truly were, the fundamental relationship with fire appears to have looked remarkably similar. Necessity, it seems, tends to arrive at similar answers regardless of which particular branch of the human family happens to be asking the question. What happened to these populations eventually, and what became of the fires they spent so many generations carefully tending in that Siberian cave is a story this history will return to before the night is over. But for now, it is worth simply sitting with the strange quiet wonder of it that somewhere in a cold, dark cave on the other side of the world from where this story began by a river, under an African sky, two entirely different kinds of humans were doing the exact same thing, for the exact same reason, keeping a small flame alive against a darkness that had never once anywhere in this long story been anything less than absolute. A fire does something to conversation that daylight simply cannot manage on its own. Ask any modern researcher who has actually sat and listened to what people talk about once the sun goes down and a strange consistent pattern begins to emerge, one that likely reaches back far further into this story than anyone studying it at first expected. An anthropologist working among the Juhoansi people of the Kalahari, a hunter-gatherer population in southern Africa, whose way of life has remained closer to that of ancient foragers than almost any other, still living today, spent years carefully recording and categorizing everyday conversation, both during daylight hours and after dark around the evening fire. The difference between the two, once properly tallied, turned out to be remarkable. Daytime conversation, she found, revolved overwhelmingly around practical, immediate concerns, complaints about a poor hunt, negotiations over sharing food, criticism of someone who had not pulled their weight that day, the ordinary friction and logistics of getting through another day of survival. Nighttime conversation gathered around the same small fire that had cooked the evening meal shifted dramatically in character. Complaints and logistics largely disappeared. In their place came stories, long elaborate accounts of distant relatives, half-remembered myths, tales of events from years or even generations earlier, told and retold with obvious skill and evident enjoyment by whoever held the group's attention at the time. Why would firelight specifically produce a shift in conversation this consistent, and this dramatic darkness itself removes most of the practical work a day usually demands? You cannot easily forage, repair a tool, or scout for danger once the light is truly gone, which leaves the fire's small circle of illumination as one of the only spaces left in an entire day, genuinely free for something other than immediate survival. Everyone gathered there sits close enough to see every face clearly lit from below in a way that daylight never quite manages, an arrangement that puts every listener's reactions on display for the storyteller and draws the whole group into something closer to a shared unified audience than the scattered task-focused clusters that daytime activity tends to produce. Scholars still debate how directly this particular modern observation can be projected backward onto the deep evolutionary past, since a single contemporary population, however illuminating, cannot on its own prove what every ancient fireside gathering actually looked or sounded like across hundreds of thousands of years and countless different cultures. But the underlying logic travels well. Once a species has fire reliably burning each night, it has also, without necessarily intending to create the world's first dedicated venue for something other than pure survival. Consider what this space alone might have accomplished across an almost unimaginable number of repetition evening after evening for generation upon generation. A grandmother recounting for perhaps the 100th time in her life the story of a terrible drought her own grandmother had survived decades earlier, teaching without ever framing it as a lesson exactly which plants had once kept her family alive when everything else failed. A hunter describing in vivid, carefully embellished detail an encounter with a dangerous animal from a season long past, the story growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling, while still carrying buried inside the exaggeration a genuinely useful warning about where that animal tends to be found and how it tends to behave. None of this requires writing or formal teaching or anything we would recognize today as deliberate education. It simply requires an audience willing to listen, and enough repeated evenings for the useful details buried inside an entertaining story to gradually work their way into everyone's memory without anyone consciously trying to memorize them at all. Picture one particular telling of that same drought story offered on an ordinary evening, much like hundreds of others before it. The fire has burned down to a steady bed of orange coals, throwing just enough light to catch the movement of hands as the storyteller gestures, describing how the riverbed cracked and dried, how the group had to walk for days toward a water source only the oldest members still remembered from their own childhood. Children who have heard this story many times before still lean in at the familiar turns, mouthing certain phrases along with her, while a newer member of the group married in from elsewhere only a season ago hears the specific details for the first time and quietly commits the location of that distant water source to memory, understanding without being told directly that this information may someday matter enormously to our own survival. No one present would describe this evening as a lesson. Everyone present would nonetheless leave it a little better equipped to survive than they were before it began. There is a further possibility here worth considering carefully, one that reaches beyond storytelling itself into the very structure of language. Filling several additional hours each evening with conversation rather than silence or sleep places a very different demand on a species than simply exchanging short practical signals during the working day ever would. Coordinating a hunt requires only a handful of clear, immediate words. Holding a group's attention through a long story about a drought survived generations earlier, weaving cause and consequence, character and outcome memory, and warning into something worth listening to for the better part of an hour, asks considerably more of whatever language a group happens to speak. Some researchers studying the evolution of human language have proposed that this kind of extended socially demanding conversation, the sort fire uniquely provided the time and setting for, may have placed real pressure on language itself to grow more complex, more capable of handling abstraction, sequence and nuance well beyond what daytime survival alone would ever have required. The evidence remains incomplete on how much weight to place on firelight specifically within this broader story of language's development, since so many other pressures were almost certainly pushing in the same direction at the same time. But it is a genuinely intriguing possibility that some of the very sentences carrying this history to you tonight may owe a small distant debt to those first patient evenings spent talking long after the sun went down, simply because for the first time in this entire story, there was finally enough safe, unhurried time available in which to do so. The circle of firelight extended outward in another sense as well, reaching beyond the immediate family gathered around any single hearth. Researchers studying networks of exchange among small-scale societies living close to this same traditional lifestyle have documented elaborate systems of gift-giving carried out over enormous distances connecting families who might see one another only rarely across an entire lifetime, sometimes only once every several years. Beads, tools, and other small portable goods pass from hand to hand along these networks, their material value often modest, their real purpose closer to maintaining a standing claim of friendship and mutual obligation that can be called upon in hard times, when a poor season in one area might be offset entirely by the generosity of a distant partner whose own region happened to fare better that year. Evenings spent gathered around a fire, whether hosting a visiting relative passing through or simply recounting news, carried from a distant camp by a recent traveller, likely served as one of the primary settings in which relationships like these were built, renewed and strengthened, one shared meal and one shared story at a time. A species capable of forming bonds this far-reaching, sustained by nothing more than periodic visits and firelit conversation, has already taken a significant step beyond the small isolated band that opened this entire story so many generations earlier. There is a physical layer to this as well, easy to overlook beside the drama of storytelling itself. A fire burning reliably each evening effectively adds several hours onto what would otherwise be a day sharply cut short by darkness hours that earlier chapters of this story spent tensely waiting out in the branches of a tree, alert for danger, accomplishing nothing beyond simple survival. Once fire pushes that darkness back far enough to sit comfortably on the ground rather than climb defensively out of reach, those same hours become available for something entirely new. The extended time each day that a raw food-dependent tree-sleeping ancestor several parts earlier in this story never had any use for at all. It is a strange thought to sit with that something as basic as firelight may have quietly created several additional hours of usable time in every single day hours that eventually filled, not with more foraging or more chewing, but with exactly the kind of unhurried talk, storytelling and shared attention that so much of what makes a culture actually depends on. The physical arrangement of these gatherings likely mattered as well, more than it might first appear. A circle of people sitting around a single fire places every participant at roughly the same distance from the light facing inward toward each other, rather than outward toward whatever task the day demanded. Some researchers studying the social dynamics of small-scale societies have suggested that this particular arrangement equal visibility, equal proximity. No one positioned obviously above or apart from anyone else may have reinforced a more egalitarian style of communication than the more scattered task-divided arrangement of an ordinary working day allows. Whether the fire circle actually caused this kind of social levelling, or whether groups already inclined toward this kind of equality simply arranged their fires this way as a natural extension of values they already held remains like so much in this particular corner of research, difficult to untangle with full confidence. The evidence remains incomplete on which direction that particular arrow of causation actually points, but the correlation itself, fire circles and egalitarian conversation appearing together across a wide range of small-scale societies studied this way, is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. What began so many generations earlier in this story as a simple practical arrangement, huddling close to warmth and light purely to survive a dangerous night, appears to have gradually accumulated an entirely different kind of value alongside its original purpose. The fire that once existed only to keep predators at bay and food digestible slowly became something else as well. A stage, a classroom, a gathering point where the accumulated knowledge, history and imagination of an entire group could be rehearsed, refined and passed forward, one firelit evening at a time, into minds that would carry it onward long after the flames themselves had burned down to nothing, And once a species begins gathering this way deliberately night after night around a shared point of warmth and attention, something else becomes possible that none of the earlier, more isolated chapters of this story could have supported on their own. A kind of connection between people that reaches further than the immediate family, further than the small band huddled around any single fire into something larger and more lasting still. Very few animals on this planet live for decades after their bodies stop being capable of reproducing. Nearly every mammal you could name continues bearing young for as long as its body physically allows, right up until illness or age finally ends its life entirely. An aging chimpanzee mother, our closest living relative, generally keeps reproducing in some capacity nearly to the end of her natural life. And when her fertility does finally decline, her overall health and survival tend to decline right alongside it, the two following each other closely rather than separating into distinct phases. Humans are a strange, conspicuous exception to that rule, and understanding why may lead us to one of the more unexpected corners of this entire story. A woman today can expect to live several decades beyond menopause. Decades in which she is, by the standards of nearly every other species on Earth, biologically finished with reproduction, yet still very much alive, active and deeply involved in the lives of her family. For a long time, this pattern puzzled evolutionary biologists in a fairly fundamental way, since evolution generally has little apparent use for a body that continues surviving well past the point where it can pass its own genes forward directly. An anthropologist studying the Hadza people of Tanzania, a population that still relies heavily on hunting and foraging for daily survival, proposed an answer grounded not in abstract theory, but in careful patient observation of exactly how food actually moves through a real living community. Watching Hadza women across different ages spend their days gathering food, she noticed something that ran directly against the assumption that older women past their own childbearing years would naturally contribute less to the group's daily survival. The opposite appeared true. Older women, freed from the demands of pregnancy and nursing their own infants, often proved remarkably effective and tireless. Foragers spending long hours digging up deeply buried tough fibrous tubers that younger mothers caring for infants and toddlers of their own simply had less time and energy to pursue as consistently. Careful measurement of exactly how much food different age groups actually brought back to camp each day confirmed the pattern was not merely impressionistic. Post-reproductive women in these communities were found to spend as many hours foraging each day as anyone else in the camp, often returning with some of the largest and most reliable hauls of any age group. Defying the common assumption that a woman's usefulness to her community's food supply simply fades once her childbearing years end, picture one such grandmother at work on an ordinary afternoon kneeling in dry sun-baked soil beneath a scrubby acacia tree, working, a sharpened digging stick steadily downward, following the faint, easily overlooked trace of a vine on the surface down to the swollen water, storing root buried well beneath it. This is not light work. It can take a considerable stretch of patient, physically demanding effort to free even a single large tuber intact from ground. This hard-packed work that draws less on raw strength than on decades of accumulated knowledge, exactly which surface traces indicate a worthwhile root below, exactly how deep a particular species tends to grow, exactly which angle of digging wastes the least effort. A body no longer occupied by pregnancy or the constant physical demands of nursing an infant can direct nearly all of that remaining strength and stamina toward precisely this kind of specialized high-yield labor, day after day for years. These tubers, difficult to access and hard to prepare, required real strength and considerable practice skill to extract from dry, compacted soil, skill that tended to improve with decades of accumulated experience rather than fade with age, the way raw physical strength eventually does. What these grandmothers brought back to camp mattered enormously, and this is where the story connects directly back to everything cooking has already changed in the bodies gathered around these fires. A tuber dug from the ground arrives tough, fibrous, and essentially inedible to a small child who has recently been weaned and does not yet have the jaw strength or the full set of teeth to manage it raw. Once softened and broken down over a fire, though that same tuber becomes exactly the kind of easily digestible, calorie-dense food a young child can manage easily, freeing a nursing mother from needing to provide every single calorie her recently weaned child requires directly from her own body. A grandmother who spends her day gathering and then helping prepare this kind of cooked, softened food is not simply being generous in some vague sentimental sense. She is directly subsidizing her daughter's or daughter-in-law's ability to wean the current child sooner and become pregnant again sooner, compounding generation after generation into a measurable difference in how quickly a family line can grow. This arrangement points towards something larger about how humans raise children compared to nearly every other primate. A chimpanzee mother cares for her single offspring almost entirely alone, nursing it for several years and generally waiting until that child is largely independent before she becomes pregnant again, spacing her offspring out one at a time because she simply has no reliable source of outside help to lean on. Human mothers, by contrast, routinely care for multiple dependent children of different ages, simultaneously an infant still nursing alongside an older sibling who is walking, talking, and demanding attention of an entirely different kind, an arrangement that would overwhelm a solitary chimpanzee mother working entirely alone. Researchers studying this pattern have described humans as unusually cooperative breeders among primates, meaning children. In most human societies are raised not solely by their mother, but by a wider network of help fathers, older siblings, and perhaps most consistently across cultures studied this way, grandmothers providing the extra hands and the extra calories that make shorter birth intervals and overlapping dependent children survivable at all. Cooked food sits at the center of exactly how that extra help actually reaches a hungry child. A grandmother cannot nurse her grandchild herself. What she can do, and what the evidence from communities like this one suggests she has been doing for a very long span of human history, is convert raw, difficult-to-digest food into something a small child's, still developing teeth and stomach, can manage, closing the gap between what a nursing mother's body alone can provide and what a growing, increasingly active toddler actually needs. Multiply that single act of preparation across an entire lifetime spent doing it, and a grandmother's real contribution to a family's survival becomes difficult to overstate. Measured not in a single dramatic rescue, but in thousands of small unremarkable meals softened and shared one ordinary afternoon after another, the proposed evolutionary logic follows from there in a way that once you see it is difficult to unsee. A woman whose own genetics happen to allow her body to live for decades beyond menopause, remaining healthy, strong and useful as a grandmother, during those years would see more of her grandchildren survive to adulthood than a woman whose body simply continued aging and declining the way most other mammals do. Over enough generations, genes supporting this kind of extended active grandmother rich post-reproductive life would spread through the population, not because that individual woman herself was reproducing any further, but because her continued presence digging tubers and tending fires long after her own childbearing years had ended measurably improved the survival odds of children she was related to but had not personally given birth to. Is it strange to think that a species might evolve to keep some of its members alive for decades specifically because of what they can still contribute rather than what they can still reproduce? It is a genuinely unusual arrangement in the animal kingdom, and humans are not entirely alone in it. Researchers studying certain populations of orca whales tracked patiently across decades by dedicated observers along the coastlines, where these animals return year after year, have documented a strikingly similar pattern, older female orcas living for many years past their own reproductive window often, leading their pods toward food sources during lean seasons using decades of accumulated memory that younger, still reproducing females simply have not had time to build yet. Whatever separates a human grandmother from an aging matriarch orca, in nearly every other respect both appear to have stumbled onto the same basic evolutionary bargain, that a body's usefulness to its family does not necessarily end when its capacity for reproduction does. Scholars still debate how much weight this particular explanation deserves relative to other proposed causes of human longevity, since menopause and extended lifespan could plausibly result from several overlapping pressures acting together rather than from grandmothering alone. Some researchers have pointed out that the theory explains the value of surviving grandmothers well, without fully explaining why menopause itself, a fairly abrupt and complete end to fertility, rather than a gradual decline, evolved in the specific way it did. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how these different explanations fit together, and this remains one of the more actively debated corners of the broader story of human evolution. But the basic observation at the heart of it, that a Hadza grandmother's daily labour measurably improves her grandchildren's chances of survival, rests on careful direct fieldwork rather than speculation alone, and it fits neatly alongside everything else this story has already traced about food energy and the slow compounding advantages of a shared cooked meal. There is something worth sitting with quietly here, something that reaches well beyond the specific mechanics of tubers and calories. This entire long story stretching back to an exhausted woman chewing raw meat by a river, so many generations ago, has been, in a very real sense, a story about time being slowly bought back, first from the jaw, then from the raw, unforgiving demands of digestion itself, and now finally from the ordinary limits of a single human lifespan. Cooking did not simply feed a growing brain. It appears to have helped make room generation by generation for grandmothers, for extended families, for a species whose members remain valuable to one another for decades longer than the harsh, purely reproductive logic of the rest of the animal kingdom would ever predict. What began as a fire keeping a family safe through a single dangerous night has by this point in the story quietly rewritten nearly everything about how long a human life can matter, and to how many people. And there is one more thread left to follow before this long night story finally comes to rest. A thread that leads not backward into deeper history, but forward into the quiet, ordinary fires still burning in kitchens, very much like the one nearest to wherever you're lying right now. Somewhere tonight in the kitchen, not so very different in purpose from the caves and hearths this story has spent so many hours inside, someone is standing over a stove waiting for water to boil or a pan to warm, thinking about almost anything except the astonishing weight of what they are actually doing. It is worth pausing there just for a moment before this story finally lets itself rest. Everything this night has traced back through began with a body in trouble. A woman by a river jaw aching, chewing raw meat and fibrous root. Long after the sun had passed, its highest point caught in an equation that simply did not balance more energy demanded than raw food alone could ever reliably supply. From that single unglamorous crisis, an entire chain of small patient solutions unfolded, one stone flake at a time, one tended coal at a time, one softened root pressed into a hungry child's mouth at a time. None of it arrived as a single dramatic invention, a hand closing around the right stone, a family choosing once again exactly which branch could hold them safely until morning, someone daring on one particular night among countless others to sit slightly closer to a dying grass fire than caution had ever previously allowed. Each of these moments taken alone would have seemed almost too small to matter. Strung together across hundreds of thousands of years, they rebuilt a species from the jaw outward. The body itself became the record of everything this story has described. Smaller teeth no longer built for 6 hours of grinding labour each day. A narrower, gut-trusting fire to do work raw digestion once they had to manage entirely alone. A brain finally large enough to hold a language, memory, and imagination in quantities no earlier ancestor could have afforded to carry, and carried alongside all of it quietly permanently a stomach lined with the same fierce acidity once needed to survive on meat scavenged from another predator's kill, a small hidden inheritance from a harder chapter. This body has never fully let go of even now. What fire changed reached far beyond any single body, though. It changed what a night could be, where earlier ancestors once climbed into branches tense and half sleeping, waiting out hours that belonged entirely to predators better suited to the dark than they would ever be a family gathered, instead around a small guarded light learned something closer to rest. And in that reclaimed darkness something unexpected grew. Stories, warnings disguised as entertainment. Knowledge passed hand to hand and voice to voice long before anyone had a word for teaching. A grandmother decades past her own childbearing years still walking out each morning to dig roots too tough for a young child's teeth, softening what she found each evening over the same fire her own grandmother once tended in a chain of care that reached backward and forward across more generations than any single family could ever fully count. It's worth remembering too how much of this story was carried not by drama, but by quiet, patient labour that left almost no trace of the people who performed it. A boy from a riverbank in Kenya dead 1.5 million years before anyone would think to wonder about him, whose narrow hips and slender ribcage still whisper across all that time about a gut already learning to trust cooked food over raw. Hunters somewhere in what would one day be called Germany, balancing carefully weighted spears in hands, steadied by a surplus of energy their raw food ancestors ever had spare to give them. Someone kneeling beside a shallow pit dug into the sand along a distant coastline burying stone beneath coals for an entire day, trusting a process they would not see finished until morning because someone before them had already proven it worked. A child in a cold Siberian cave born of 2 entirely different branches of the same human family, sleeping soundly beside the fire her parents, whatever else divided them, had both learned to tend in exactly the same patient way. None of these people ever met one another. None of them ever knew their small, unremarkable evening would eventually become part of anyone else's story at all. There is something almost tender in remembering how much of what we know about all of this came from evidence no one alive at the time could have imagined leaving behind. A Neanderthal somewhere in what is now Spain chewing on a bitter chamomile for reasons of comfort rather than hunger, never guessed that trace would survive tens of thousands of years inside the hardened film on our own teeth. Extra copies of a single gene quietly duplicating themselves somewhere deep in the human genome across generations of starchy fire. Softened meals never announced themselves as anything remarkable at the time, and yet they sit today in your own cells in mine, a small inherited signature of exactly how thoroughly this story rewrote the body carrying it forward. There is a pattern worth naming plainly here, one. This channel keeps returning to story after story because it keeps proving true. Nothing about becoming human happened quickly, and almost nothing about it happened by design. It happened the way water eventually carves a canyon, one patient, almost invisible movement at a time, invisible to anyone living through any single one of those movements, unmistakable only from the great distance we are standing at tonight. The people inside this story never knew they were changing the future. They were only ever trying to get through one more difficult night, one more hungry season, one more cold winter, in a cave far from anything we would recognize as home, and yet tending exactly that small, urgent, unglamorous need again and again. Across an almost incomprehensible span of time, they built almost everything that makes your own life recognizably human tonight. Look closely enough at any of this and the same quiet truth keeps surfacing over and over, no matter which particular thread you happen to be following. Power in this story was never a throne or a border. It was a body's own chemistry jaw and gut and brain slowly renegotiating the terms of survival across a span of time too long for any single mind to hold. Collapse in this story was never an empire falling. It was a lost ember on a rainy night, a fire that failed to catch again before hunger became something closer to crisis. Memory in this story was never written down. It lived instead in a grandmother's hands in a story repeated by firelight until a child could recite it without knowing that they had learned it at all. And resilience, the kind this channel keeps circling back to in nearly every history it tells, looked here exactly the way it usually looks underneath all the grander language historians sometimes reach for. Ordinary people doing an unglamorous essential task over and over long enough for it to change everything. There is one last detail worth holding on to before this story finally sets itself down. Deep inside that South African cave where researchers once found ash and burned bone dating back roughly 1 million years, the chemistry of those ancient cold remains is in every way that actually matters identical to the chemistry of a fire lit and put out only last week. Carbon is carbon, ash is ash. The same simple elemental transformation, wood and heat and air becoming light and warmth, and eventually a fine grey residue that outlasts nearly everything else a life leaves behind. Nothing about the physics of that fire has changed in all the time separating that ancient hearth from your own kitchen tonight. Only the hands changed. Only the faces, the languages, the shape of the world around each fire. The flame itself has been telling the same simple story faithfully, without a single alteration for longer than anything else our species has ever managed to keep consistent. If there is one final image worth carrying out of this entire story, it may be this. In caves scattered across 3 different continents, layer after layer of ash sits stacked in the soil, undisturbed for hundreds of thousands of years, each layer marking a fire that someone once built, tended, and eventually let rest. Different hands, different faces, different languages, different beliefs about the sky and the dead and everything else. A mind large enough to wonder eventually wonders about. But the same fire in the most basic sense returned to again and again on nearly every continent this species ever reached, cold or warm, safe or dangerous. Right up to the small blue flame steadying itself under a pot in a kitchen somewhere tonight, or the quiet glow of whatever light happens to be nearest to you as you listen to this now. The chain was never actually broken, it only ever changed hands. That thought can rest now, quietly, the way the rest of this story is about to. There is nothing left to explain, nothing left to prove. Only this left to feel. Think for a moment of everything a single meal has always meant. Long before restaurants, long before recipes, long before anything written down at all. It meant someone gathered something. Someone else kept a fire alive long enough to use it. Someone shared what little there was with a child too small to gather anything for themselves. That is the whole of it, really. That is what survived. Not a monument. Not a name carved anywhere. A small warm act repeated. The woman by the river never knew what would come from her exhaustion. The child lifted into branches each night never guessed what her curled, careful fingers were slowly preparing her descendants to release. The grandmother, kneeling in dry soil decades past her own children's childhood, never imagined how far her tired hands were reaching. They were only ever trying to get through the night. Somehow that was enough. It still is. Every stove lit tonight, every pot set to simmer, every parent softening food for a child too young to chew it alone. All of it still the same old patient answer to the same old ancient problem. You do not have to remember any of this to carry it. It is already inside you, in the shape of your jaw, in the size of your gut, in the particular quiet ease with which your body turns a warm meal into rest. Somewhere right now, a fire burns low. Not the same fire, never the same fire, but close enough. A hand feeds it one more small piece of wood without even thinking. The flame settles, steadies, holds, and the dark once again waits just a little further back than it did before.